Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of Planet and the People, the podcast that explores the many different facets of climate change and how best we can save our planet. So, it is week, I don't really know anymore, of the lockdown. It's all sort of merged into one. But I've decided to introduce this episode while sitting up a tree. Because, why not? That is what this episode is all about. So apologies for the sound of wind, it is quite a stormy day. So trees and forests have often been described as the lungs of the planet. They suck in the warming carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they pump out oxygen, they provide a home to millions and millions of different species all over the world, and in many ways they are part of the heart of the planet. But deforestation is a major issue. It has been for a long time, and this year we have seen an unprecedented scale of wildfires across Australia and the Amazon, among other places, which is why reforestation organisations are so important. And I was delighted to speak to one of my favourites, Hannah Wickes at Ecosia, the tree planting search engine. So, without further ado, I will once again pass you over to my past self before I fall out of this tree, and Hannah Wickes at Ecosia. Hannah Wickes, welcome, and thank you very much for talking to me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, you are the CMO of Ecosia. Mm-hmm. And for people who are completely ignorant and don't know about Ecosia, tell us what it is. It's the tree planting search engine. So what is it? Tell us how it works.
Ecosia is a search engine, like any other search engine. You're probably thinking of a very big one right now. But what we do with the profits that we make from ads that run on the search engine is invest that into tree planting. So we are probably the definition of a purpose-driven business. So we run like a normal business, except we're giving all the money away to tree planting, which does change a lot of the things that we do as a company. And there's two parts. On one side, we're a tech company, and we run a search engine which is used by 15 million users. And then the other side, we're a tree planting organization, and we've planted, I think, at this stage, it's around 87 million trees, but it's always ticking upwards and gradually growing up. And those trees are planted by a number of partners around the world. So it's a two-pronged kind of thing, what Ecosia is.
So you've got quite a lot of partnerships, and those partnerships are working on different projects. How many partnerships do you have at the moment?
There's 31 different partnerships, but to be honest, we're currently bringing on more. There's trees are planted in thousands of locations around the world. Last check from my mind, I'd have to check with our chief tree planting officer, Peter, but there were over 9,000 individual locations where our trees are located. And what we kind of have is a tree portfolio. So if you're heavily reliant on one kind of tree, one kind of way of doing tree planting, that makes you vulnerable. So what we have is a really diverse portfolio of different tree planting techniques, different ways we do it, different tree species that we're planting, and different reasons why we sign up for different projects. So it gives us diversity, and that goes right down to the trees we're choosing to plant. So we believe in diverse forests, which kind of then trickles up into everything that we do.
Yeah. So with your partnerships, is it basically Ecosia's funding these organisations that are doing things, or are you on the ground as well? Is it a combination?
It's a combination. So our tree planting team goes out and does a lot of tree planting visits and has a lot of consultation with tree planters on the ground. Tree planting is seasonal. So you can't usually, depends where you're located, depends how much rainfall you have. You can't really plant trees year round in a lot of our projects. And it varies completely depending what hemisphere you're in, what kind of climate you have. If it's more rainforest kind of trees that you're planting, then it's a lot easier to plant more frequently. But it really depends, and there's a lot of variety in that.
So do you plant trees all over the world in all the different climates? Because it's funny, from the Ecosia app that I have on my phone, we'll come to that and later, the actual details of how it works. But a lot of it seems to be developing countries in South America and Africa and Asia in some places. Do you plant trees in Europe as well?
We do plant trees in Europe. So we have trees that we are planting in Spain. Spain is already being heavily affected by the climate crisis. So the climate there is quite vulnerable. It's increasingly dry every year. So we're doing some reforestation projects in southern Spain. We are looking at planting more in Europe and also ways that we can protect forests in Europe that do exist. One of the reasons why you noted developing countries, the reality is it's because they are biodiversity hotspots. So we tend to prioritize places where there is high levels of biodiversity, lots of different species, whether they be plant or animals, and where we can have a lot of impact, where that tree is going to benefit the ecology around it. So we tend to prioritize those, and quite often they're near the equator line. And incidentally, on the flip side of that, a lot of those areas are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And there's communities that also benefit hugely if you start doing tree planting in the areas. So there's basically flow-on positive effects for a lot of our projects. So when we're evaluating it, we're looking at what will these trees actually do? Yes, it's great to have a tree in the landscape, but what's it actually going to mean to the community that are there? What's it going to mean for local wildlife? What ecosystem is it going to bring back? What species will it protect? So there's a lot of factors when we're deciding like this project over that project.
And have you seen already, what have been the impacts of your work so far on the communities and on the people and on the wildlife and the landscape?
I think one of the most exciting things I've seen is water coming back into the landscape because of trees. So when you remove trees from the landscape, and I'm Australian, you might not tell from my accent, but when you remove trees from a landscape, things get incredibly dry and the water table tends to drop. So when you start to bring trees back, they also bring water back. So that's been one of the big kind of topics and themes throughout our projects is actually how do trees interact with local weather systems? How do they bring water back into the landscape? Because if you start to bring water back, then people can also start growing more fruit and vegetables. One of my favorite projects is in Senegal, and it's forest farms. So it's looking at mixing, the way you plant is so unique. So you get Ecosia trees, which have huge thorns. Then you put almost a barrier around this land that you want to plant trees in to stop goats, which are nemesis of many of our tree projects, to stop goats from getting in. Yeah. And then you start planting fruit trees, varieties of native trees. And then beneath the canopy, you're able to actually support fruit and vegetables that otherwise wouldn't grow. So you usually are able in that situation, and we work very closely with local farmers, that they commit to starting a forest farm, that we support them along the way in doing that. But what they're actually able to do is switch from a diet which is heavily dependent on peanuts, which is the national crop of Senegal, to switch to something which is incredibly healthy and nutritious. So what I kind of like is, what can that tree do in the landscape? By deciding to plant trees, what can we change about the way people are living, the way they're interacting? And so that's kind of one of my favorite, really practical examples of how it works. But it really depends. Every project is different. Every country is different.
Is that what you would call the forest farms? That's agroforestry as well. Is that the same thing?
Essentially it's agroforestry. It really depends. It's done on quite a small, very local scale. But other ones are really important, like Uganda. That's another favorite project I have, and we work with the Jane Goodall Institute there. Oh, yeah. What's happened is there's been massive deforestation caused by sugarcane farming, and farmers feel a lot of pressure to switch over to a crop that is bringing in yields. But what that means is that patches of forest remain, but they're too small to support large chimpanzee populations. So what we're attempting to do is plant corridors of trees to connect these now isolated patches, and that will support the biodiversity of that species and hopefully prevent its extinction because it's critically endangered. So basically there's no trees in that landscape. So how do I get this one patch of forest and connect it to another patch of forest? And rather than going, let's just fill an entire landscape with trees where you are dealing with local communities who maybe don't want to do that, you're like, let's build a corridor instead. Let's start there and then build upwards.
What are some of the organisations that you're partnering with? I've got a few lists of the Eden Reforestation Project. That's one you do. And some of the work you're doing, such as the Sahel Desert, is expanding, and you are working with an organisation. Is that OZG?
So Burkina Faso is actually one of our biggest projects, and it's also one of the most difficult landscapes to try and attempt to plant a tree in, because it is the Sahel Desert, like you say. So the Sahel Desert is gradually moving down. So areas that were maybe like scrubland or even forestry before that are now turning into desert. And as the impacts of climate change are more and more felt, as the climate gets harder and harder for people to grapple with, that's speeding up. So what we do in Burkina Faso is we work with local partners on the ground, and we plant trees at scale. Now, what happens is that tree, rather than growing upwards, it has to put down this huge root system. So it's incredibly difficult for that tree to survive. So a lot of the growth you don't even see. One thing that you do see, and when we visit the tree planting projects, we try to get an idea of the scale. And so we took a drone out to try and see what's happening. And what you can see with that is how they're being planted. And that's what's unique about Burkina Faso. We plant in half moons. So to collect water, in order for that tree to survive, you have to kind of carve out in the really dry soil this half moon shape. And then as soon as the rainy season hits, the water collects in this half moon and creates almost like a little pool. And then that patch remains green. And then the tree has enough nutrients and water to survive.
So you dig this half moon around the tree?
Yeah. So the half moon is like how, rather than planting a hole for the tree to go into, you almost like carve out a half moon kind of shape. So almost like a welled area for it to have, for the water to collect in. So, yeah, Burkina Faso is a really interesting one. It's been tree planting at scale in an incredibly difficult environment. There's been an excellent partners on the ground also. So there's a lot of connection with local communities and making sure that the entire village is on board. It's also an area that is increasingly getting more and more dangerous in some parts of Burkina Faso as well. So we're having to work with our partner on that as well. But it is a project that I am really excited about because of the sheer scale which it operates and what you're able to do there.
Would you say that already you're seeing an impact because you're sort of restoring the water cycles that have been damaged by climate change, and that is sort of taking things back a little bit?
It's definitely, depending on which project you pick, you can definitely see the flow on positive effects, and they're helping to mitigate the impacts of climate change. It's a big thing to claim, but I think you can impact local weather systems, and it's about creating environments that when it does finally rain, that you have trees there to collect it, that it's not just going to run away, the water's not going to run away with the topsoil, that you actually have something there that can grip the land. But like with Burkina Faso, we've had, I think it's almost 11.5 million trees planted, and they're going to take a long time to grow with that climate, but they're incredibly important if we're going to really impact that area and face climate change as it happens in that region.
On that, I mean, I was going to ask you this question at the end, but it's sort of, what would you say the impacts and how quick is the impact of these projects on the climate itself?
Oof. I think that it depends if you're looking for macro or micro effects. For micro effects, I think the impacts can be seen very quickly. It depends where you plant. Like somewhere like Indonesia, the trees can be massive within a year. They can have because it's rainforest style environments, and so they can have a really strong impact very, very quickly. I do think trees like mangrove trees, you mentioned Eden before, we worked with them in Madagascar, and we planted millions of mangroves along the coast. And something really interesting about mangroves is how much carbon they sequester. They grow quite quickly, but they also sequester up to 10 times the amount of carbon as a normal tree. That's because of huge root systems. But what those root systems are also doing is if you have extreme weather caused by climate change or a flow-on effect of it, it can actually like mitigate some of that as well, because they act like a cushion. If you have like a tornado, like if you have a cyclone coming in, what can the mangroves do to prevent that huge kind of water hitting inland of the country? So there's so many things, like it's hard to drill down to one thing that a tree can do in a landscape, but at scale, yes, it definitely has positive effects and quite quickly.
So with that in mind, how positive do you feel about the situation? How hopeful are you for the future of the climate, basically?
It's a very big question. I think trees are definitely a solution that nature has given us, and a very powerful one. But to be honest, we are planting at big scale, but it's not enough. It's a drop in the ocean of what we need. And you can do as many positive actions as you can. And I think it's testament to people, the fact that we've got 15 million users who are using Ecosia in order to plant trees and help mitigate their impact on the environment is really positive. But it's not enough when you consider that we're still reliant on fossil fuels. Unless we move heavily away to sustainable, renewable energies, then we're going to face a really uphill battle here. So these things have to work hand in hand. So tree planting absolutely is a solution that has been given to us, and it needs to happen at scale. But on the flip side, you also need to start putting carbon into the atmosphere as well. So it's a challenge. I think it's also a challenge that's unique to each country. Like the UK can really up its tree planting, but then it needs to consider what kind of tree planting it's doing. Are we looking at diverse forests, diverse native forests, or are we looking at forestry where those trees will be cut down quite quickly? Each landscape is different. Each country has a different set of challenges. And if we all kind of pitch in on it, I think there is hope in this, but it's definitely not going to be easy. And we need to slow things down quite quickly, I think.
Yeah. With some of the recent disasters that have been happening, following on from being a bit hopeful or not hopeful, I mean, the Amazon rainforest and Australia, the huge amounts of wildfires that happen, and obviously the Amazon and Australia see wildfires every year, but this was unprecedented in the damage that was caused. How much of a mission are we facing as a world to bring those back?
The Australian landscape, wildfires do happen, bushfires do happen in Australia frequently. The scale of this was unbelievably, as an Australian, it was unbelievable that it could happen at that scale. But those forests largely regenerate.
Yeah.
Each of these were unique, so it's going to be interesting over the coming months to see. We've started tree planting in Australia in the wake of it, but what we're looking at is rainforest that was burnt. Rainforest is never meant to burn. It's not like bushland or gum trees in Australia that tend to burn and then they release seeds. So it's a part of their process.
Okay.
While rainforest burning is a very, very bad sign. So that is very concerning. So we're doing tree planting in Australia to help mitigate that.
That's Ecosia is doing that?
Yeah, we announced that in January, and the first I think 1,000 trees went in the other weekend. It will gradually scale it up. It's still the beginning kind of that tree planting season. So we'll be doing that over the next coming months. With the Amazon situation, it's a very different one. So obviously that is to a large part rainforest, and that would not be burning and not being cleared. And a lot of the reasons why that is happening is quite complex. Like does tend to think that it is related to food and meat and our consumption of meat. And yes, that's definitely true. But there's a lot of rules and legislation in place that are driving up deforestation and puts a lot of pressure on people to start fires as well. And
is that unrelated to sort of our consumerism of meat and everything else?
It's not unrelated. So there are a few things where there are large tracts of land, and if it doesn't become farmland, if it's not farmland, it gets returned to the state. So you have to keep it clear in order for it to remain farmland that you own. Otherwise, it returns to the state. So that law that exists in Brazil actually means that every year people clear land at a rate that is not sustainable.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you've got huge demand for beef and the clearance of land for that. So these are two kind of effects. And once a fire starts, it can, in very dry conditions, be very hard to put out. So we work largely in the Mata Atlantica rainforest, which is on the coastline, which is only 20% of that is left. So it's very overlooked. It's in the shadow of the Amazon. But the very similar causes happen there to why this forest disappeared. It's incredibly fertile land underneath. And so people wanted to farm it. And now there are forest fires that happen frequently in that region as well. So we actually fund firefighters to try and help protect our projects in that region. The complexity of what you need to do to tackle these issues is huge. And I don't think there's a simple solution. I do think with the rate of the planet warming as it is, we're going to see more and more fires. And so finding ways to mitigate that and work with that and work around it is going to be a real challenge ahead.
I didn't realise you also you're funding firefighters, and you're funding the sort of prevention of fires.
Yeah, it's a small. So with Brazil, it is a massive country. There is so much diversity in what you can do to tackle the challenges there. So we have 100 different partners, and they all have different projects that they're working on. One of these partners are firefighters. They're like, this is what we can do in our region. This is how we can support. This is how we can prevent trees being destroyed. But every kind of project has a different take on it and what suits their local community and what they can really get traction with as well.
Just going back to agroforestry, and you were mentioning about the sort of the crops that can be grown within forests. You said that is on quite a small scale. Would that work on a larger scale, agroforestry?
Absolutely, agroforestry can work on a larger scale. So, and it's working in Senegal because we work with individual farmers who are essentially growing land for themselves and friends and family and for market. But agroforestry could work at scale, and particularly could work at scale in Europe. So we have to bring farms back into the farming landscape, and it's possible to do that. And it actually creates far healthier ecosystems. So you can do alley cropping with trees. You can figure out lots of different ways to do it. I think if you look at the UK, for example, hedgerows are a really interesting example. A lot of trees are in hedgerows, but in order to scale up farming, a lot of hedgerows were destroyed, and that's happened over a long period of time. So there are ways that you can bring trees back into the landscape. And I think that we're facing a challenge now, and it's like, let's look at farming anew. How can we do this? How can we tackle it?
Yeah. And so now moving on to the search engine itself, so the tech side, as you said, that you're essentially a tech company, even though all of this what we're talking about is very not tech. How does the search engine itself work in terms of clicks? If I, as one individual, go and do however many searches on Ecosia throughout the day, how will that directly impact your projects?
Yeah, so how Ecosia works, like any other search engine, in that we have ads at the top of the search engine. And those ads are how we tend to fund a lot of our projects. So what happens is, at first maybe a user is like, oh, I'm planting trees, but they generally revert to their normal usage behaviors quite quickly. So sometimes they're clicking on random articles or links, and other times they're interacting with ads. And depending on what that user behavior is, we're then able to plant trees off the revenue generated with that. It's, if you're never, ever, ever clicking on an ad, then potentially we're not able to ever plant trees. But on average, the average user, it can be around 45 searches that they will then plant a tree with the funds raised from those ad clicks.
Okay, so you mentioned, I don't know if you said, which search engine do you think I'm talking about? How do you compete with search engines, which are massive monsters that have been going around for ages, that people will automatically go towards, and the service that they will get from those search engines will be of a particular standard? How do you compete with them? Because, I mean, I've been using Ecosia for a while, and I don't really notice the difference that much between Ecosia and other search engines like Google.
It's a challenge because there is a monopoly in the market. So, and there's a big market leader. It's a bit of a David and Goliath situation. And so you have got a unique challenge there. And I think Ecosia has almost a hidden advantage because we do have a purpose. We exist to plant trees. And so people get very motivated and very excited about that and their ability to personally plant trees. When people reach out to us, they're often like, where are my trees? Like, how are my trees? It's very personal. And I really like that aspect of what Ecosia does. It's connecting people with the natural world through tech, which seems like a bit of a leap, but is actually something that is possible to do, especially if your purpose is not driven by driving shareholder value and shareholder revenues. So we have a unique advantage there. And I do think that there is we have a very visual, exciting story to tell. Like, we are able to show you where your trees are. And because we are a tech company doing tree planting, the way we do it, we geotag different trees so we know where they are, we track them over time, how they're going. And on the flip side, the one thing we don't want to track is user data. So we have very little interest in compromising people's privacy. And that stems probably to some ethical choices that we've made as a company, that we didn't want to use people's data to make more money. And yes, potentially there is a revenue hit there. And sometimes the search results can also be restricted because we don't know everything about you. We don't know you did this and this and this and this, and therefore you might like this ad. And that's a decision that we made as a company to be privacy focused. But it is something to remember. I think that there is a monopoly, yes, and there's a very big player in the market, but they know an awful lot about you, and I think it's a personal choice over how comfortable you are with your data being owned by a bigger company like that.
What would you say to maybe someone if they said, I tried using Ecosia, but it's just not quite as sort of effective and efficient as Google? And what would you say to that?
I'd say, using Ecosia lets you plant trees. And the reality is that you don't need to use the same thing all of the time. So if you occasionally are like, you know what, I need this search result about this very, very specific thing, and maybe we don't know everything about you in that circumstance, it's okay to switch between. You wouldn't go to the same restaurant every night. So and you wouldn't go to the same website for news right now, like on Corona, for example. I'm not going to the same. I'm checking different sites. I want to know different piece of information, and I think that's fine. The reality is it doesn't have to be a hard no.
Yeah.
Ecosia is improving all of the time, and we're putting a lot of effort, and our engineers are working very, very hard on it. But it's a learning journey for all of us. So I think use Ecosia, use it as much as you can. But if you need to switch back at some point, you can do that as well.
Yeah, that's exactly what I say to people. I've got it as my default search engine on my laptop and on my phone. But if I don't find what I'm looking for, I just look somewhere else. So, I mean, I'm going to go really basic and fundamental, but how does it work on your phone, for example, if you want to use Ecosia as your main search engine, but you've got Safari or you've got Google Chromecast or whatever, and then there's an app that's an alternative.
So Ecosia has an Android app and an iOS app, and they're two slightly different things. So the Android app is a Chromium browser. So what that means is you can download it to your phone, and what I do on my phone is I have it right where the search engine goes in the middle of the screen. I download and drag the Ecosia thing there. So by force of habit, I always open it when I'm doing a search. And I would recommend if you're an Apple user to do the same thing. And yes, there are kind of inbuilt behaviors and people are very used to Safari, but you need to do the switch across. So switch the position of the app on your phone. Downloading the app is relatively simple.
Yeah.
And we tend to see huge growth for things like you mentioned the Brazil fires, for example. Like 500,000 people were like, oh, what can I do to help? And so at that point in time, I think we went number 1 in 26 countries in the App Store, and everyone's downloading it. But the thing is, it's an app that you use every day. So switching the position so you can get to it and remember that it's there is really important. For your laptop, it's a bit different. We run off extensions. So you can download an extension in whichever browser you like. They usually have a store. For Safari, it's a bit different. It's a Mac app. And you can just search for Ecosia and then download it. And it will run like a normal search engine. So whenever you write something in the top bar, it comes up. You're also able to track your trees. There's a counter on the side which shows you the number of searches, number of trees, therefore you're planting. So you can kind of monitor that over time as well.
Yeah. Well, that's all very clear.
Good.
Is there a difference? Is there a difference in popularity with Ecosia in different countries? Or is it fairly different?
No, we have searches have come in from 187 different countries. So people care about this topic globally. But I would say we're a German company based in Berlin. So we have obviously a strong home market. France is an incredibly big market for us as well. So our biggest city, for example, is Paris. We see so many searches coming from Paris. And I think, Francis, you've got a unique relationship. They're not big fans of big tech from the US. And plus on that, they're incredibly environmentally aware. So this combination has meant that that market has really taken off for us. And I would say the UK, in the past year, I think people's awareness about the climate crisis has increased dramatically. And so has the growth in Ecosia. And I think the US is also quite similar. So we're really starting to see steady growth there as people become more and more concerned and want to find things they can do, very practical things to help mitigate their impact.
Yeah. Well, that's good to hear. And what are your sort of future plans for expansion? Where do you want to get to, sort of everyone using Ecosia, and what would you want to achieve with that?
That's a very big question. I think the larger Ecosia is, the more trees we can plant. So our goal is to be able to plant as many trees as we can in a diverse way. So diverse tree planting, and also to help protect trees as well. So the more users we have, the more growth we have in that area, the more people use us, then definitely that's the challenge we have ahead. I also think one thing that makes me really hopeful is Ecosia's users skew younger. So we tend to have like 60% of our users are under the age of 35. That's not our data. We don't know that. That's external data. But that is a very young user base, and it's younger than all the search engines out there. And frequently we hear when we get approached for interviews or partnerships from adults, they're like, oh, my kid told me about you, or my teenage son told me about you, my daughter told. So there's a big usage base. So I think there's something really hopeful in that. And I really hope that we can stay with that audience and really support them through what is going to be a really tough time coming to terms with the climate crisis. And they're the generation that is really going to have to step in there and help us fix this.
I have to say, when I first started using Ecosia, that you have a little section where you can look at the projects that you're doing, and I felt I was at point where I was feeling rather depressed about the situation, about climate change, about the climate crisis, and it was very uplifting reading about all the projects, and I said, okay, the world's not over.
It's not so bad. It does. There is something when you can see action, when you can see positive steps being taken, even if it's as simple as a sapling being watered in a tree planting nursery. That moment, you're like, oh, and I particularly love that out of all of the photos that we share, that it's generally those nursery photos of someone watering tree saplings that everyone's like, I like this a lot.
Yeah.
So all the likes and the comments, and it's very incredibly popular. And I think it is, you're right, it is hopeful, which is kind of unique in this space at the moment.
Yeah. A sort of slightly unique question to the here and now. What do you think the impact is of the current situation with COVID-19 on climate change?
I think it's really hard to say at this stage what the impacts will be. I think it's been pretty immediate that we've seen like the level of pollution go down, the level of carbon being released into the atmosphere, but it's hard to know what economies are going to do in response to this. Are we going into recession, and what does that mean in terms of production? What does that mean in terms of how we're going to fly, and how people's behavior is going to change through this event? And it's really hard to predict what will happen. And I don't think it's always going to be positive, because quite often when you have a downturn, you try and make up for it later. So it could be that we flip back after this as well. And it's really, I would say, really hard to say.
Yeah.
That's my answer to that very difficult question. But I do think there are things that we are going to learn through this process as well, like learning to be a little bit more self-sufficient, learning to kind of have more respect for where things are coming from and how hard it is actually to supply us all with food. And these kind of things, like you're thinking more about the way you live and realizing that it actually is an incredibly complex thing for you to be able to fly to New York. And what does that whole process involve? And maybe this should be slightly more difficult. So that's, I think we'll learn from this experience. I don't know what it's going to be, and I think it's going to be really difficult. But it'll be interesting to see what happens on the other side.
Yeah, certainly. I would ask, I'm jumping from different themes all over the shop right now, but just a quick question about how you at Ecosia power your operations in terms of, just as a question, what sort of platform do you use? What energy?
We have our own solar plants. So we committed to this a couple of years ago and started adding solar panels to different buildings around Germany. So we have a couple of our own solar plants now. We're currently in discussion. I need to check this actually, but I think up to 8 that we're now looking at, because obviously we're growing. So how can we get more renewable energy into the grid? And for us, if we overproduce green energy, we put it back into the grid, and that will push out dirty energy. So it is kind of something that we're working to be far ahead of our requirements. So internet does use quite a lot of energy. So what can we do to be one step ahead by producing energy? And at the moment, we're focusing on solar, but that could expand down the line as well.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much, Hannah, for talking to me this afternoon. Suppose I'll just have a quick one. What's your favourite project of all of them you've got? Can you answer that? Is that too hard a question?
That's a really hard question. I think the Senegal project, the forest farms that I mentioned, I really love. I also am a big fan of our latest project in Australia. I think what they're doing is amazing. They're taking tropical trees, replanting them. It's all in the Byron Bay region, an area I know very well. So for me, that project is very personally motivating right now.
Yeah.
For that one.
And what's your favourite tree?
Oh, that's very hard. I do love the oak. We don't tend to plant any of them in our project.
No.
But I love it. I love how long they last for. I love how they look in the landscape, and I love that they start from such a tiny, tiny acorn. So that one, yeah, probably an oak.
All right, okay. Well, I think that's a good answer, and a good answer to finish on. That was Hannah Wickes from Ecosia. You can see why after listening back to that interview I decided to run outside and climb a tree to introduce it. I have since climbed down from that tree as it was getting a little bit windy and precarious, as you could probably hear. So if you want to hear more about Ecosia, they are on social media at Ecosia on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. You can also, of course, Ecosia them and make their search engine your default, as Hannah explained. And also, if you go to the search engine, you can scroll down and see a little bit more about all the projects that they are doing. So, that brings us to the end of episode 4 of Planet and the People. Thank you very much for tuning in. Next week I'm going to be speaking to Chiara Vitali from Greenpeace about the work of Greenpeace and about climate change as a whole, but also specifically touching back on food systems and deforestation once again. So the podcast is now on social media, at Planet and the People on Instagram, Planet and the People on Facebook, and at Planet and the P1, the number 1, on Twitter. So if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask for future episodes, and if you'd just like to follow the podcast and find out more, then do give us a follow. So, on that note, I'm going to say goodbye. Wish you another good week in lockdown. My name's Tom Ward Thomas, and this is Planet and the People.